She was a lost cause. Her face was streaming with tears, and she reached for him, but he flinched away and got up to pace to the window. He didn't want her to touch him, and she wept for the lonely, hurt child he had been and for the emotionally distant and psychologically scarred man that he had become. He was sharing what he felt were his most shameful secrets, and it broke her heart that he thought this was his shame and not that of the pathetic excuse of a man who had fathered him. "I never felt like I deserved you," he said, keeping his rigid back to her. "But like I told you before, I just couldn't stay away from you after that first meeting. I kept making and breaking promises with myself just to spend time with you. When I proposed to you, I thought that I could manage the relationship, that I could keep your love for myself without tainting you, without hurting you. God, what a miserable job I did of that." He started pacing in front of the window, prowling back and forth like a restless lion and shoving his hands into the pockets of his tailored trousers. "The night you told me you were pregnant." He stopped moving and grimaced as if the memory pained him as much as it did her. He allowed himself a quick, haunted glance at her before turning away again. "I went off the deep end, Braun. I panicked. I couldn't be a father, not with my history. What if I hit our baby? What if I started hitting you? My mother always told me that my father never touched her until after I was born. She never said as much, but she made me feel like the catalyst to all that violence. What if I was the same? What if our baby's birth triggered the same reaction in me? What if I hurt you?" I couldn't stand that thought, Braun. "But then I ended up hurting you anyway, didn't I? I hurt you with my wild accusations and the irrational and stupid things that I said. Words can be even more painful than fists. I knew that, but I still couldn't seem to stop myself. I didn't even believe the crap I was saying. And I honestly did think that you would end up hating me for getting you pregnant in the middle of your studies, that you would grow to resent me." He shook his head and sat down opposite her again. "This is going to sound like some lame, stupid excuse, but that night, when I told you to leave, I wanted to give myself time to think and to breathe. I never meant for you to leave the house, Braun, just the room." I calmed down almost immediately and realized what a fool I was being. I didn't know what kind of father I'd be, but I figured that with you by my side I could possibly be okay. I'd taken care of Rick practically from the moment he was born, without once hurting him, and the thought of raising a hand to you is so abhorrent that it sickens me. I stopped thinking of us as a couple and started imagining what it would be like to be a family. The thought of anyone, especially me, hurting you or Kayla is unbearable, but how do I know something won't set me off someday? How can you ever trust me around her, knowing what you do about me now?" Bronwyn had her hands pressed over her mouth again as she tried to muffle her sobs, but she was wholly incapable of preventing the tears from flowing down her cheeks. She was a mess. She wanted to go to him, but she knew he would not permit it, not until after he had said his piece. Yes, the emotional wound had been lanced, but the pus that had been festering away beneath the surface for so long had to drain before the healing process could begin. "I'd just made up my mind to tell you everything," he continued in the same rambling, disorganized way that had characterized his entire monologue up till now. He was bouncing between the past and the present, just stating his thoughts as they popped into his head. "I heard your car starting up and I panicked. I was so sure that you would hurt yourself. I immediately gave chase and had my accident. Thinking I saw you there, I think it was the only way I could cope with having driven you away. I think that my subconscious had to have you betray me, because it gave me an excuse to tell myself that I hated you. I needed that excuse because knowing that I was to blame both for your leaving as well as for my deafness would have sent me even further off the deep end, but I never stopped looking for you, Braun, and it wasn't just about finding the baby. I think that part of me always knew that you would never have done what I accused you of doing, so I had to find you to be sure you were both okay. I was so ashamed of my behavior that I even withheld the news of your pregnancy from Rick and Pierre. What I'd done was completely inexcusable, and both Pierre and Rick would have had no qualms about letting me know that." He raised his eyes to hers and winced when he saw her tears. His jaw clenched and his hands curled into tight fists before he lowered himself from the sofa to kneel directly in front of her chair. He placed his hands on the armrests, effectively caging her in, but she didn't feel trapped. Far from it. She felt liberated. I was such a fool, Bronwyn. His voice had lowered, and she wasn't sure he knew that he was speaking barely above a whisper. She had to strain to hear him. I'm a wreck of a man, and I brought you into this hell with me, and ruined your life in the process. You didn't ruin my life, she protested, but he shook his head at her denial, not believing her. It sounds crazy to say that I loved you too much and that my love destroyed us, but I feel like that's what happened. I'm toxic. I've always known that, and to even consider a fresh start with you, he laughed bitterly. I'm a selfish idiot. Do you love me? She asked him quietly, and he blinked at the question. What? He asked blankly. Well, you just said that you loved me too much. She rolled her eyes. As if that's such a bad thing. But you used the past tense. So do you still love me? That's a stupid question, he growled. It's a valid question, she dismissed. Of course I love you, he nearly shouted. It's not a question of me not loving you. I beg to differ, she interrupted, waving her hands at him. It's very much a question of you not loving me. You never told me you loved me. Not once. Okay, when we married, quite honestly, I didn't even know I loved you. I told you, I'd never had anyone love me for no reason before. I didn't bloody know what love was. His voice rose on the last three words, but she merely raised her eyebrows at him. Do you know what it is now? Yes, he whispered. Yes, I know. Well? It's, he floundered for a few moments before inhaling deeply. It's everything, isn't it? It's the quiet dinners when not much gets said. It's the sunny days at the beach. It's hearing your laughter in my head when I see Kayla giggling. It's seeing the love in your eyes when you watch our baby sleep. It's watching the sun rise in your smile and set in your tears. It's the contentment in seeing you eat and sleep and study and play. It's the small, everyday things, like never getting tired of watching you tuck that same stubborn strand of hair behind your ear 20 times a day. And it's the huge life-altering things like seeing your smile and my eyes on our beautiful little girl's face. It's knowing that even if you turn away from me forever, I'll always be the better for having had you in my life. She leaned forward and stared deeply into his grave blue eyes for an endless moment before reaching out to cup his strong and stubbled jaw with her slender hands. He had trustingly laid his beautiful, wounded soul into her keeping, and she would protect it fiercely. There you are, she whispered wonderingly as the edges of her lips tilted up into a tiny smile. She formed her words as clearly as she could, not wanting him to misunderstand her. I've been looking for you. His stern brows lowered in confusion, and she leaned down to press a feather-soft kiss to his sensuous lips before easing back so that he could see her face again. There's the man I married. His eyes widened as her words registered. He swallowed and then swallowed again, his Adam's apple bobbing with the movement. She watched him valiantly try to keep it together, to remain strong as usual, but her steady gaze seemed to completely unravel him. His shoulders heaved as he drew in a convulsive breath, and the sound that tore loose from his chest when he exhaled again was an unmistakable sob. It's okay, she said, stroking one hand down the side of his face, and it was that gentle touch that undid him completely. His face crumpled, his eyes filled, and he finally, dropped every single defense that he had built up over the years and allowed himself to weep. He tried to turn away. Even after everything that he had just revealed, his first instinct was to weather this storm of emotion alone, but Bronwyn wouldn't let him. She put her arms around his neck and held on tight. His head dropped into her lap, and she folded herself over him so that she was wrapped around him. She crooned the same soothing little sounds that she used when Kala cried, hoping that he could feel the slight vibrations coming from her chest and throat. His weeping was raw, violent, and gut-wrenching. Her own tears had all but blinded her, but she was determined to be strong for him, and she refused to allow them to overwhelm her. This moment was for this beautiful man who was so very terrified of allowing himself to be happy. It's okay, she whispered into his hair. It's okay, Bryce. The words were ridiculously inadequate, of course. It was very far from okay, but she was still processing the ugly truth and trying to figure out how to deal with everything he had revealed. He was so very, very damaged, but his revelations only gave her deep and abiding love for him a sharply protective edge. She would be damned if she'd allow him to spend one more second thinking that he wasn't deserving of her love. She now understood that the mistakes he had made had been his twisted and misguided attempts to protect her from the monster he believed himself to be. The realization was heartrending, and her scorching tears slid silently down her face and into his soft hair. He felt like hours later when his sobs came to a shuddering stop. For a moment he simply allowed himself to rest in her arms, before she felt the tension creep back into his big body, and he lifted himself out of her loving hold and moved to stand beside the window again. He kept his eyes averted as he self-consciously tugged at his dress shirt, which had wrinkled beyond repair. She watched as his ravaged face closed up and shook her head with a sigh before standing up and placing herself squarely in front of him, giving him no option but to meet her eyes. She had carefully weighed all of her possible responses to his tormented disclosures and knew that there was only one way to play this without stomping all over his fragile male pride. "You're an idiot," she said quietly, and he blinked in confusion. "I don't. How could you even think that you're capable of hurting Kayla or me?" she asked, rolling her eyes to convey exasperation. "We've had some huge arguments in the past, and I've never felt remotely threatened by you. Bronwyn, I always walked out in the middle of our arguments, remember? It used to drive you crazy, but every time I felt myself getting too angry, I'd rein in my temper and walk out because I was so terrified that I would hurt you physically." "Bryce, what's the angriest you've ever been with me?" she asked him gently, and he shrugged helplessly. "When you told me you were pregnant?" His statement came out in question form, as if he wasn't entirely sure of his answer. "No, you weren't angry then," she denied. "You were afraid to allow yourself to hope and lashed out because of that fear. I know that now. I'm talking about real anger. The kind that makes you feel like your head's going to explode." "I don't know." He looked confused. "I don't think that I've ever allowed myself to get too angry with you," he admitted, and she snorted, showing her disdain with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Please, I can recall several incidents off the top of my head. Like the time I told Rick that you enjoyed getting the occasional manicure with me. You were so furious you were practically breathing steam." "Okay, I was pissed off," he admitted uncomfortably, looking a little uncertain. "Justifiably so, since Rick has never really let me hear the end of it. He still makes the odd snarky comment about it. But that's petty stuff. I'd hardly hurt you over something so trivial." "Oh? Your father never beat you over trivial things then? Like a 3-year-old's accidentally dropping a watch into a toilet bowl?" "It was a gold watch," he muttered. "It was a watch." She signed fiercely. "Gold, diamonds, whatever. Breaking a 3-year-old child's arm because of it isn't a normal reaction. What if Kayla did the same thing? Would you hit her? Break her arm?" He paled at the question and shook his head in unconscious rejection. "No, you wouldn't," she answered for him. "Of course you wouldn't." "I don't." "What about when we were on our honeymoon and I danced with Sasha Tisdale? You nearly went purple with jealousy." "You still remember that jerk's name?" he asked incredulously. The same jealousy flared in his eyes again, and she grinned irreverently. "Well, he was really, really good looking," she reminded, and he glowered, starting to look less shocked and more like the arrogant man she knew and loved beyond all reason. "Seriously? You think that second really was warranted?" "I only left off the third one in deference to your fragile ego," she teased. "Bryce, you were beyond irrational about that dance. You were jealous and possessive, but nowhere near violent. Now, I'm no expert, but from what I've read about abusive spouses, they barely need an excuse to trigger the violence. Even when you were emotionally hurtful, even then, you were punishing yourself more than me." She switched to sign language. "It's just not in your nature to be violent. How do you know that? How can you be sure?" he asked. His eyes were filled with anguished uncertainty, and she cupped his jaw before going up on her toes to plant a kiss on his gorgeous mouth. "Because even at your most irrational, When I thought you were kicking me out of the house, and then, after my return, when you seemed to hate me so much. I never once feared you. Not once, Bryce. I'm so sorry, he whispered, shutting his eyes and ducking his head. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. She stopped his words with a soft kiss, and his eyes opened and met hers. She ended the kiss with a smile. I know you are, she acknowledged. I forgive you, Bryce, and I love you very much. You do? She nodded. Of course I do. I don't think that our problems have been miraculously resolved by any means. I think that we have a long, hard road ahead of us actually. But I think that we can finally move forward. I've been going back to therapy, he admitted softly. It's been helpful. I hope that we can go together sometime, she said, and he nodded. I'd like that. He stared down at her with something like awe in his eyes before shaking his head in disbelief. How the hell did I get so lucky? I got lucky too, you know, she pointed out, and wrapped her arms around his waist. Last night I said that I fell in love with a man, not a superhero. But you know what? You are my hero, Bryce. How can you say that after everything that's happened and everything that you've heard tonight? Bryce, if anything, tonight has taught me that you're the kind of man who would place himself squarely between his family and any threat. Of course you're a hero. Mine, Kayla's, Rick's, never doubt that. Bryce stared down into the tear-ravaged face of this woman who meant the world to him and saw sincerity shining up at him. It was in her eyes and in her smile, and the relief that coursed through his body nearly buckled his knees. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he really felt like everything was going to work out. That somehow, against all odds, he had managed to redeem himself and win his wife back. The panic and fear that he'd been living with for more than 2 years, no, even longer than that, since they had first married, was dissipating, and he felt years younger. He captured her mouth with his own and kissed her with desperation that bordered on obsessive. When he eventually felt able to let her go, they were both flushed and breathless. I'm going to marry you someday, Bronwyn Kirkland Palmer, he told her with a cocky grin, and she licked her lips dazedly. Do you have a timeline on that wedding date, Mr. Palmer? She asked him sweetly. Hey, don't rush me, lady. We've only just started dating. I have big plans for this courtship, you know? Oh. What kind of plans? She asked, curious, rubbing her body sensuously against his. He smiled gently before cupping her face and tilting her head back for another one of his drugging kisses. You're just going to have to wait and see, he muttered, his voice alive with promise. Chapter 17. 12 months later. Haven't been back here since before the accident, Bryce told Bronwyn as they stepped into their beautiful holiday home in Nisna. They had arrived after dark and so had missed out on the house's spectacular panoramic views of the gorgeous lagoon and Nisna Heads. Still, the serenity of the place was reflected in the sounds of the quietly chirping night insects and the susurration of the gentle waves lapping at the shore. Bronwyn was filled with mixed emotions as she stepped into the huge stone foyer. The last time she had been here hadn't been a happy time for her, and as she glanced around the gorgeously appointed house, all she could see was her former self disconsolately drifting from room to room like a lonely little ghost as hope faded to despair with every passing minute. The domestic staff had been in before their arrival since the place was freshly cleaned and the refrigerator restocked for their weekend here. He hadn't told her that this was where he was bringing her, but she had easily recognized the unmistakable garden route and had known for hours where they were headed. The drive had become more and more tense with every kilometer that the car ate up, and the last hour had been mostly quiet without Kayla around to break the silence. They had asked Rick and Lisa to take the little girl for this weekend that Bryce had so carefully been planning for weeks. Bronwyn wandered into the living room and he trailed after her, dropping their bags in the hallway. She made her way to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the tranquil lagoon. Because of the pitch blackness outside, she could see nothing but her own troubled reflection staring back at her, and she tracked Bryce's movements as he came up to stand behind her. He placed his hands on her slender shoulders and tugged her back until she was leaning against his chest. She went willingly into his loose embrace, her head tilting back until it rested just below his shoulder. His strong arms folded around her narrow waist, his hands rested against her abdomen, and his lightly stubbled jaw nuzzled into the nook just below her ear. She could feel his gentle, warm breath washing against the sensitive skin of her ear as he exhaled deeply. "I know this place holds some pretty unhappy memories for you," he murmured, his lips brushing against her earlobe as he spoke. "I want to replace those memories with sweeter ones." She dropped her hands and entwined her fingers with his. "Will you give me the chance to do that for you, Braun?" he asked thickly, and she blinked away the tears before nodding. She watched his reflection in the glass and saw the naked relief on his face at her response. "Thank you," he said before sucking her delicate lobe into his mouth. She dragged in a harsh breath at the sensation. His hands moved to the curve of her waist, and he turned her around before she fully understood what his intention was. She had her hands braced against his broad chest and could feel the accelerated beat of his heart as he stared down into her eyes. He had looped his arms around her waist and his hands were now resting just above the curve of her behind. "It's been years since I kissed you last," he observed urgently, his eyes dropping down to her lips and dilating when she sucked her full lower lip into her mouth to moisten it. "It has been years," she agreed, even though it had been mere hours. Ever since they had started seeing each other again, they had been getting increasingly hot and heavy with the petting, and while they had gotten close to making love, they had always stopped before the point of no return. Neither of them wanted to muddy the waters with sex before they both felt that their relationship was strong enough to withstand all emotional and physical obstacles. They would not rush into bed until they were both completely ready for it. Somehow, by unspoken mutual agreement, they knew that this weekend would see them consummating their new relationship. Bryce had known it when he had planned the trip, and Bronwyn had known it when she had agreed to go with him. He groaned and dropped his hungry mouth onto hers and just about ate her alive. Bronwyn met his desperate kiss with feverish concentration, her tongue dueling with his in a battle for supremacy. The kiss eventually gentled, and his hands lifted to cup her face as he tilted her head for easier access to her mouth. He loved holding her face when he kissed her. His thumbs were always restlessly stroking her soft skin, brushing over her cheekbones and tracing the delicate line of her jaw. After a long while, he eased up, his tongue retreated, and his mouth softened as he feathered butterfly kisses on her lips and up over her cheeks and down into her neck. Their kiss had been mostly silent, punctuated by heavy breathing and the occasional gasp or desperate moan. Now, as he lifted his head to stare into her eyes, he smiled gently down at her. "I love you," he whispered, and Bronwyn's face lit up as she smiled radiantly at him. "I know you do, Bryce, but I never get sick of hearing those words," she told him. "Well, since I'll never get tired of saying them, I guess we'll have to resign ourselves to making each other revoltingly happy for the rest of our lives." He stepped away from her reluctantly, and Bronwyn had to bite back her protest as his gorgeous and visibly aroused body moved beyond her reach. When she unconsciously raised one of her hands toward him, he tut-tutted and waved a finger back and forth in front of her face. "Hands off the merchandise, lady. I have plans for this evening and I can't have you distracting me. Why don't you head up for a nap and a shower? And chat with Kayla like you've been dying to do for the last hour? Leave me to prepare our dinner." She grinned at the thought of him bumbling about in the kitchen. He really wasn't the domestic god he seemed to think he was. He made a terrible mess and his meals were often culinary disasters, with unpalatable over- or undercooked dishes. Still, he tried, bless him, and she appreciated his efforts. He was always so disgustingly pleased with himself that she didn't have the heart to mention the occasional raw potato or the burned edges on a steak. She blew him a little kiss and headed toward the hallway, picking up her overnight bag along the way. "Dress code?" she turned to ask him, and he shrugged, "Casual." She nodded and turned away again. "Give the munchkin my love." She flicked him a thumbs up to acknowledge his request. She made her way back downstairs an hour later, feeling refreshed after a short nap and a long shower. She had also called Kayla to say goodnight, but the little girl had been distracted by a game she was playing with Reese and Rick, so the call had been a little rushed. She had taken Bryce at his word and hadn't dressed up, wearing only a pair of jeans and a loose t-shirt. She hadn't bothered with shoes at all, The underfloor heating kept her feet warm enough. Whatever Bryce was cooking up in the huge kitchen smelled surprisingly good. She was a little mystified when she got to the kitchen and saw no trace of him. Curiously, she poked around a few of the scattered Tupperware containers left on the white marble top of the gorgeous stone island in the middle of the kitchen. The whole house had a spacious log cabin feel to it, with its stone floors and wooden walls and high-beamed ceilings. Unfortunately, her search yielded little in the way of answers except to inform her that whatever Bryce was offering for dinner was of the stick-in-the-microwave and heat variety. Which could only mean that he had asked someone else, probably Celeste, to cook it. She smiled ruefully at his minor deception, but her taste buds were truly grateful. She heard a sound coming from the living room and headed in that direction. She found him out on the large, covered balcony, which had a spectacular view of the lagoon. In fact, they were so close to the water that it actually felt like they were on a boat out on the lagoon when they stood on the balcony. In winter, they were able to enclose the space entirely by slotting in glass panes between the eaves and the balcony railing. It allowed them to still enjoy the view without being exposed to the cold wind and rain. It was a pretty mild evening, so Bryce had a couple of the panes open, allowing the night sounds and the fragrant briny air to drift in, was bustling around the round table that he had shifted into the center of the balcony. It was covered in a white tablecloth, the finest linen of course, and he had pulled out all the stops, bringing out the best china and silverware for the occasion. He also had a gorgeous bouquet of red roses in a crystal vase as the centerpiece of the table. He was currently struggling to keep the candles lit. Every time he managed to get one tiny flame burning, a breeze would snuff it out, and he was starting to curse under his breath. She giggled to herself when he tried again, only to be foiled by another mischievous gust of wind. She lovingly traced the lines of his strong back with her eyes and saw that he had changed his clothes. He was wearing a pair of faded jeans that conformed beautifully to the gorgeous curve of his firm butt and a black dress shirt with a pair of running shoes. His hair was damp and a bit messy, so he must have showered sometime in the last hour. He swore even more vituperatively than before, and she rolled her eyes before walking up to stand beside him. He was so absorbed in his task that he didn't notice her until she placed a hand on his back. He jumped before relaxing when he saw that it was Bronwyn. "I can't get the damned things lit," he groused, gesturing to the two tall, white candles beautifully showcased in their sterling silver holders. Bronwyn twined her arm around his and sandwiched his large hand between hers. She rested her cheek against his hard deltoid and contemplated the problem, while idly playing with his fingers before straightening up and smiling at him. The living room light illuminated the balcony just enough to enable them to see each other. She held up a finger indicating that he should wait there before dashing back inside for a few minutes. She returned with a triumphant smirk, holding up 4 little scented Glade candles in glass holders. They usually kept them around for candlelit baths. He grinned and grabbed a couple of the glasses from her. "Vanilla?" "My favorite," he announced happily as he placed them strategically around the table. After they were lit, he frowned doubtfully at the scant light they offered. "Are there any more?" he asked, and she nodded. "I didn't want to ruin your dinner by having the whole place reek of vanilla." "Everything would taste like cake," she signed a fair point, he acknowledged. "I think this is perfect." She waved her arm at the table and he smiled. "I think you're perfect." She snorted at that unnecessary bit of flattery, and he grinned again, sweeping her up in a hug. "I'm starving," he growled, nipping at her neck to let her know exactly what he was starving for. As if the erection insistently pushing against her wasn't proof enough of that. She giggled and pushed him away. "Down, boy," she teased. "I want to see what culinary feast you've prepared for us tonight." She didn't miss the flash of guilt in his eyes as he uncovered the chafing dishes at the other end of the beautifully decorated table. "We have," he cleared his throat nervously, keeping his eyes averted, "roast beef soup with creme fraiche, followed by salad with vinaigrette dressing." More throat clearing. He really was getting truly awful at deception. Stuffed flank steak served with baby potatoes in a garlic butter sauce, and triple chocolate mousse for dessert. Her lips twitched at his discomfort as he raised miserable eyes to hers, and when he saw her gentle smile, he heaved a huge, sad sigh. You know, don't you? He asked wretchedly, and she nodded. I'm sorry. I wanted everything to be perfect tonight, and I didn't think burned meat and hard potatoes would cut it this time. Again his gaze shifted slightly to the left of her as his cheeks lit with shame. She put a soft hand on his jaw and turned his head until he was looking at her again. Bryce, you're a man of many talents. Unfortunately, cooking isn't really one of them. I love you for trying, and even though those other meals weren't perfect, I enjoyed them because of the love that went into the preparation. That said, this looks truly delicious, and I'm happy you decided to forego cooking tonight. Where did this come from? Initially I thought you may have asked Celeste to prepare something for us, but this doesn't at all resemble anything she has cooked for us before. Yeah, it's from a local restaurant. They delivered it earlier when the housekeeper was still here. They left very specific instructions on how to reheat everything. I hope nothing has dried out or spoiled. I'm sure it'll be fine. She waved aside his concern. He helped her into her chair and draped a napkin over her lap with flair. He sat down to her left and angled his chair so that he could see her face and hands clearly. The meal was divine, and they joked and fed each other as they devoured the food in front of them. They had made their way through half a bottle of delicious Cabernet Sauvignon, and as they licked the last of their chocolate mousse off their spoons, Bryce reached for the bottle to refill their long-stemmed wine glasses with the burgundy liquid. He raised his glass and eyed her expectantly. She smiled and raised hers as well. I know that I'm not the easiest guy to get along with, Braun, he murmured, his voice shaking. And that when you decided to give this relationship a second chance, you also took on a whole boatload of my emotional crap. His voice wobbled, and he paused to gain control of his emotions. I'm just so happy that you gave me another chance. She knew that. His ebullience over the last couple of months had been hard to miss. He was still terrified of losing his temper around her and Kayla, but Bronwyn wasn't above pushing his buttons in order to provoke a response from him. She trusted him not to hurt them, but she wanted him to trust himself too. Their therapist, in a one-on-one session with Bronwyn, had suggested that course of action, and they were making progress. He had lost his temper with her just 2 weeks before, after Bronwyn had ditched Paul while she was out shopping. Recognizing how furious he was after Paul had informed him of her transgression, she had deliberately gotten belligerent in an effort to get him to lose his icy control and had then watched in unflinching awe as her ex-husband completely lost his legendary composure for the first time in her memory. He had ranted, raved, paced, growled, and even snapped a pencil, but he hadn't even gotten close to harming a hair on her head. After he had calmed down, she had smugly kissed him and murmured, "You don't scare me, big man. But I promise to be more careful in the future." He had looked a little dazed after that and slightly mollified by her words. But the look of befuddled self-discovery in his eyes had been one of the sweetest things she had ever seen. After that he had stopped carrying himself like a man tiptoeing on eggshells around Bronwyn and Calla. Bronwyn had learned a lot more about him over the last 2 months than she had dreamed possible. At first it had been a little disheartening to discover just how much he had kept hidden from her in the past, but at the same time she had recognized that he was fundamentally the same man that she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Sometimes, he was saying, still in that low, rough voice that shook with the force of his emotions, I wonder how the hell I got so lucky. I don't deserve you, no matter what you say, and I am awed, humbled, and so damned grateful that you're in my life. He cleared his throat and carefully placed his glass back on the table before, quite unexpectedly, dropping out of his chair and onto one knee in front of her. Confused by the clumsy movement from her usually graceful ex-husband, Bronwyn wasn't sure what was happening at first until he started patting at the breast pocket of his shirt. Flabbergasted, she watched as his eyes flared in panic and his hands dropped down to his jeans pockets and frantically started digging around in them. She started to get an inkling of what his intentions were and tried to hide her grin at this less than suave proposal. Damn it, I wanted it to be perfect, he was muttering to himself, but she didn't think that he was aware of the fact that he was speaking out loud. He fumbled with something small and gleaming that he pulled out of the same breast pocket he had abandoned just moments ago. When he raised his vulnerable gaze to hers once more, there was sweat beading his forehead, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. "I played this out in my head so many times," he confessed hoarsely. "I envisioned hot air balloons, brass bands, and huge, extravagant spectacles. But in the end, perfection for me was having you to myself in a private place where I could beg you to end my miserable, lonely existence without you. You give my life purpose and meaning. Every beat of my heart belongs to you. I love you, Bronwyn. Please marry me." He opened the palm of his hand and Bronwyn gasped when she saw the ring lying there. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her eyes going misty. It was her ring, the one he had given her after his first proposal, the one she had so reluctantly sold years ago. "How did you track it down?" "I never even told you the name of the shop I used. I emailed pictures of the rings to just about every pawn shop proprietor on the garden route. It took a while, but eventually one emailed me back with the information I needed. He had sold it to an elderly lady who said that it reminded her of her own wedding set. She's a regular customer of his and luckily had enough of a romantic heart to sell the set back to me when she heard why I needed it." "The set? You have the wedding ring too?" she asked in disbelief, and he nodded somberly, "Yes. I wasn't sure you'd want the rings back, but I took a chance that you'd recognize it as a symbol of my enduring love for you. I may not have known it, but I loved you the first time I proposed and never stopped loving you. Not once. If you want something else, I could." "Don't you dare," she choked out the words. "Don't even think about it." "So you'll marry me?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course I'll marry you," she said with a watery smile, cupping his jaw before leaning down to plant a kiss on his beautiful mouth. "I love you too. So much." He started grinning like an idiot before clumsily placing the ring on her finger. They both stared down at the gleaming diamond and emerald cluster before Bryce lifted her hand to his mouth and dropped a lingering kiss on the ring. "Don't take it off again," he whispered. "Never," she promised fervently. "Never." She kissed him again, winding her arms around his strong neck and toying with the hair at the nape of his neck. She felt him tense as he pushed his way to his feet, taking her with him. She refused to relinquish her hold on him, and he wrapped his arms around her slender waist, dragging her even closer. The kiss got hot so quickly they were gasping for breath but unable to surrender each other's mouths. "God, I could eat you alive," he rasped, lifting his lips from hers and sweeping them down over the graceful column of her throat, over her delicate chin, until they once again landed, with searing intensity, on her open and gasping mouth. His hands moved to frame her small face, and his palms drifted down her cheeks until his thumbs brushed the underside of her jaw, where they exerted enough pressure to tilt her head back even farther in order to accommodate him more fully. His tongue swept into her mouth, and they both shuddered at the invasion. Her delicate hands molded over the strong, sculpted contours of his torso and up over his pectorals until her fingers unintentionally brushed over the small, flat male nipples, which were hard as pebbles beneath the thin material of his shirt. He hissed at the sensation, and she teasingly moved her hands away from the highly sensitive area. "Touch me like that again." He lifted his lips only long enough to issue the rough command, and Bronwyn moved her fluttering fingers back up and over his chest, kneading and exploring hungrily along the way, until she reached her goal. She copied a move from his playbook and gently flicked the tiny nubs with her thumbs until he groaned against her lips. She was fully committed to the kiss, enjoying the musky taste of his mouth and the unbearably erotic sensation of the rasp of his tongue over hers. Her skin burned at every point of contact, but she still couldn't get close enough to him. It had just been so long since they had been together like this. He cupped her firm behind through the denim of her jeans and hefted her up. She happily took the hint and wrapped her long legs around his waist. She kept her mouth glued to his, even while he stumbled his way into the living room and nearly dropped her in the process. He got only far enough inside to turn and brace her against a wall. "Sweetheart, I'm so hard for you," he whispered. The words were completely redundant since she couldn't miss the solid ridge of his masculinity pushing up against her through the thick denim of their jeans. He shifted her until her own hot core was rubbing up against that delicious length of flesh that she could feel throbbing despite the layers of clothing between them. She wriggled and ignored his groan as she tried to lower her legs, wanting to stand. Thankfully, he seemed to know exactly what she wanted, and he stepped back to allow her down. Free to do what she was aching to do, Bronwyn clumsily unbuttoned the fly of his jeans. No easy task when he was pushing up against the unyielding material and leaving her with little room to maneuver. She succeeded at her task and his rigid penis spilled into her waiting hands. She gripped him tightly and stroked him in a way designed to drive him a little crazy. He groaned, fighting to maintain his composure, and kissed her gently, his velvet-soft lips firm while his tongue forged its way into her mouth. Bronwyn was helpless to do anything but open for him, and she gasped when his hot tongue immediately sought and coaxed a response from hers. Her grip tightened around him, and the sound that emerged from his throat was so anguished that, for a second, she thought she might have hurt him. He lifted his head and stared down at her intensely. "I love what you're doing, Bron, but I don't think I'll last much longer if you continue doing it," he warned. Bronwyn sighed and reluctantly released her prize after one last, lingering stroke that very nearly undid him if his reaction was anything to go by. It took a few moments of gasping and muttered curses before he opened his eyes again to scowl down at her feverishly. "You drive me crazy," he said shakily before claiming her lips in a kiss that was the polar opposite of the gentle one he had given her before. It was hot, possessive, and downright raunchy. Her hands fluttered aimlessly for a few seconds before reaching up to bury themselves in his luxurious hair. She arched up against him and he muttered something unintelligible into her mouth before releasing her face. In a move so fast it had her head spinning, he swung her up into his arms and strode toward the living room sofa. "I'm sorry, babe." His voice was strained as he placed her on the soft sofa, kneeling on the floor beside her. "I don't think I can make it up to the bedroom." "Are you sure you want this?" She rolled her eyes at his ridiculous question and pulled him back toward her. He made a half-laughing, half-groaning sound as he claimed her lips again, smothering her own happy little giggle. She had the softness of the sofa against her back and the hardness of Bryce plastered against her front. He made no attempt to hide his obvious arousal from her as he climbed onto the sofa with her and unabashedly settled between her spread-eagled thighs before grinding himself up against her hot center. "I've missed this," he confessed, relinquishing her lips again. "I've missed us." "Me too," she admitted, losing herself in his burning gaze. "Gorgeous," he ground out thickly, reaching for the hem of her plain t-shirt and tugging it up and off her in seconds. Bryce stared down at her small breasts with such burning intensity that she knew she was blushing from head to foot. "Pretty," he grunted, his voice so thick she could barely make out the word. One strong forefinger traced the delicate, scalloped edge of her shell-pink demi-bra, and she sucked in a breath when the tip of his finger came within a hair's breadth of the hard little peak of her breast. His other forefinger echoed the movement on her neglected breast, and she moaned huskily, arching herself up in the hopes that he'd touch her the way she needed to be touched. He smiled in response before placing the flat of one hand on her chest, between her breasts, and gently pushing her back down. "No rush, babe, relax." He barely got the words out before dropping his lips on her mouth again for another fiery kiss. Bronwyn inhaled sharply, breathing in the delicious smell of him, before wrapping her slender arms around his back and digging her fingernails into his hard muscles, lifted his head and trailed his mouth down over her chin, down her delicate neck, down to her chest, until they reached the barely there slope of one breast. His lips traced the same lacy edge his finger had explored moments before, and Bronwyn shuddered when she felt his hot moist breath against her overstimulated nipple. "Please," she whimpered. Please. His mouth descended onto the tight, aching nub through the satiny material, sucking so hard that the pleasure bordered on pain. Before the sensation became too uncomfortable, he eased off, regretfully dropping the softest of farewell kisses onto the delicious little morsel before moving over and gracing her neglected breast with the same treatment. He sat up abruptly, kneeling between her widespread thighs, looking primal and fierce with his hair mussed, a flush highlighting his harsh cheekbones and his jeans unsnapped at the waist. She hungrily drank in the sight of the hard pillar of flesh relentlessly pushing up from the open fly of his jeans before shifting her gaze back up to his eyes. He was doing a bit of visual devouring of his own, dragging his ravenous gaze up and down her half-naked body with an intensity that made her quiver in response. He dragged his shirt up over his head, not even bothering with the buttons, and tossed it aside. Bronwyn nearly moaned out loud at the sight of his well-developed upper body. Her hands helplessly reached up to trace his well-defined pecs and abs, and she watched in intoxicated fascination when his muscles bunched and leaped beneath her wandering hands. She already knew his body so well, but still felt like she was seeing and discovering him for the very first time. She sat up too and hungrily sucked and licked the salty, smooth skin of his chest until he groaned painfully. "You're so..." The rest of his words were muffled against the skin of her neck, which he dragged into his mouth hungrily before moving back up to her mouth like it was some irresistible lure that he could not stay away from. His hands found the clasp of the bra at her back, and she felt the garment loosen but remain sandwiched between their bodies. She moved far enough away from him to yank the offending scrap of satin and lace away, plastering her naked skin back up against his hot, smooth chest. He hissed at the feel of her against him and dragged his head up to gaze down at her pouting little breasts in unabashed hunger. They were both kneeling on the large sofa now, both topless and dressed only in their jeans. Bryce cupped her breasts and tested their slight weight in the palms of his hands before his thumbs descended onto the hot coals of her raspberry red nipples, flicking and teasing at them while she arched her back in an effort to get them into his mouth. Not one to turn down such a very delicious invitation, Bryce complied with her unspoken demand and dragged first one sweet little nub into his mouth, and then the other. The sensation was so overwhelming that it stole the breath from her body and left the scream of ecstasy she'd been about to utter lodged in her throat. Sensitive, he grunted unnecessarily, his voice filled with primal satisfaction. He barely lifted his mouth from its delicious task to utter that guttural observation before dipping back down to where the creamy, berry-tipped treats awaited him. He had one strong, large hand braced firmly against the small of her narrow back. His other hand was working at the snap of her jeans, and before she knew it, he deftly pushed the stiff denim far enough down past her narrow hips to allow his eager fingers room to delve between her slender thighs, where they cupped the dripping wet band of satiny material at her core. Bronwyn ground herself up against his hand while Bryce, a consummate multitasker, still had his mouth on her overwhelmingly sensitive breasts. His fingers were burrowing beneath the line of her panties, and one very talented digit immediately found its way to the little knot of nerve endings at the junction of her thighs. He strummed her delicately for a few seconds, and Bronwyn convulsed violently, a strangled cry of crippling pleasure tearing from her throat. Recognizing that she was on the verge, Bryce replaced the finger with his long thumb and found the tight, wet entrance to her body, which he breached with a gentle, yet assertive, thrust. The combination of his thumb on her clitoris, his long finger lodged firmly inside of her, and his mouth tugging insistently at an aching nipple sent Bronwyn tumbling over the edge of insanity, and the scream ratcheted even higher as her back arched even more while her hips thrust frantically at his hand. Her hands were digging into his broad shoulders, and Bryce stared down into her face, drinking in the sight of her prolonged orgasm like a man dying of thirst. After what seemed like an eternity, Bronwyn stopped convulsing against him and her cry faded into breathless little sobs as she melted against him. He gently allowed her limp body to slide down onto the sofa, where she lay staring up at him with wet eyes and a look of utter, shocked devastation on her face. He smiled tenderly, dropping a kiss onto her gasping lips before tugging her jeans and skimpy pink bikini briefs down her languid, unresponsive legs. He made a frustrated noise when the clothing snagged at her ankles but managed to prevail before tossing them aside triumphantly. "Love me, sweetheart?" he asked roughly, and she smiled contentedly up into his sweaty face. "More than you can possibly imagine," she mouthed, and he grinned happily. "Good. I'm going to make love with you now," he proclaimed intently, and she swallowed a giggle at the solemn announcement. He looked so serious. "Well then, stop talking about it and get on with it," she said, still fighting for her breath after her massive climax. He growled at the challenge and tugged a condom from the back pocket of his jeans before impatiently shoving them down to his knees and dropping down between her spread thighs. Bronwyn, who was starting to feel halfway normal after the emotional and physical wreckage of her overwhelming orgasm, stared up at him when his face appeared in her line of vision. The ruddy color along his stark cheekbones had intensified, his eyes looked feverish and desperate, and his hair fell down to frame his face in a wild mane. She had never seen him look more intense and focused. She raised her heavy head and looked down to where he was poised like a battering ram between her legs. She could see the head of his shaft above her feminine mound, and she felt the rest of the hard column sawing up against her cleft. An instant later and her head fell back with a moan when the intense sensations surged to life again. The friction was driving her crazy, and she could see by the way his face tightened that it had a similar effect on the gorgeous man braced above her. Her hands moved up to his face, where she traced his lips, then his cheekbones, with wondering fingers, and he groaned helplessly. She watched as he leaned back and fumbled while putting the condom on. "Sweetheart," he growled after he had taken care of their protection. His eyes were boring into hers intensely. "I want you to reach down between your legs and take me in your hand." She was happy to obey him, reaching down and grabbing hold of him in one of her eager hands. Her fingers could barely close around his girth. "Put it inside," he commanded roughly, and she inhaled a shuddering breath before obediently positioning him. She moved her hips a little and hissed when the broad head slipped inside. His brow was furrowed in concentration and his eyes closed in ecstasy as he very carefully inched even farther ahead. Bronwyn groaned at the achingly familiar feel of him. "God, this is amazing," he groaned as he sheathed himself even farther. His eyes shut involuntarily. He hissed painfully when she thrust up against him. "No, babe. Please don't move. I can barely keep it together, Bron." "If you move," he gulped in a breath and released it slowly before moving a little farther. Bronwyn, loving the incredible feeling of fullness, helplessly contracted around him, and he breathed a little prayer as he paused again. "So long," he moaned, almost incoherently. "It's been so long, but I want this to last." She moved her hands up to his face and angled his head until he opened his eyes to look at her. "It's okay," she said as clearly as she could. "It doesn't have to be slow this time." He kissed her with hungry gratitude before boldly surging forward. Bronwyn raised her knees to his hips as she pushed herself up to meet his thrusts. One of his hands slid down over her naked thigh to hook beneath her knee and raise her leg a little higher. The slight change in angle had him hitting her spot with every urgent thrust, and it drove her wild. She was beyond thinking about anything but this moment, this man, and his masterful ability to turn her into a ruined, incoherent mess in mere moments. Her arms snaked around his neck as she held on for dear life while he hammered into her. His lips were nibbling at her ear, his breathing was hot, labored, and liberally interspersed with groans as he lost himself in her. Bronwyn matched his thrusts with her own, and as she found herself hurtling toward another powerful climax, she arched her back and tangled her fingers in his hair. "Bryce," her voice broke on his name, and her breath caught as she felt herself clamping around his hardness. In that incredible moment, she completely forgot that he couldn't hear her. "I'm coming," he increased his tempo when he felt her tightening, not needing to hear her in order to recognize the familiar signs of her impending orgasm. Bronwyn went as taut as a bowstring, right on the verge. "That's right, my love," he encouraged breathlessly. "Come for me." He drew himself nearly all the way out, until nothing but a whisper of him remained inside of her and she sobbed in frustration, before he plunged back in, angling himself to hit her just right. That was all it took to send her screaming down into the abyss. The intense contractions of her climax were enough to send Bryce plummeting down after her with a cry of pleasure. He moved his hand from the crook of her knee and flattened it against her back to pull her as close to him as she could get, while he shuddered inside of her for what seemed like forever. Afterward, they both went completely limp, occasionally jerking as pleasurable aftershocks hit them. They remained that way for a moment, still joined together and too drained to move. Bryce was planting idle little kisses on her damp neck, and Bronwyn was stroking his sweat-soaked hair. "You're breathtaking," he murmured into her ear before stirring himself long enough to move off her and remove the condom. She groaned in protest when he left her briefly to dispose of it in the downstairs bathroom, kicking off his jeans and underwear in the process. He was back in seconds and stood grinning down at her nude body in immense satisfaction. Sated, sweaty, and ever so slightly smug, he informed her. "That's how you look." "That's how I feel," she confirmed lazily, lifting her arms toward him. "Why are you standing there? Come down here. I'm cold, I need you to keep me warm." He smiled tenderly and entwined his fingers with hers before tugging gently at her hands. "Let's head up to bed," he suggested, and she pulled a sulky face. "I don't want to move," she pouted. And he chuckled before releasing her hands to swoop down and deftly scoop her up. Bronwyn squealed and looped her arms around his neck when she felt herself slipping. He tightened his hold on her and clutched her possessively close to his chest. Bronwyn nestled her face in his neck and nuzzled his warm, delicious-smelling skin contentedly. When he reached the bedroom, he gently deposited her on their huge king-size bed, dropping down to join her. He immediately reached for her again, seemingly unwilling to relinquish his hold on her for very long. Bronwyn loved snuggling up against his big, hard body. It always made her feel protected. They did nothing more than stroke and pet, still sated after their shattering bout of lovemaking. "Bronwyn, I can't promise not to make mistakes, and I probably will inadvertently wind up doing stupid things that may hurt you in the future. I'm not perfect. I'm just a man and as flawed, more so, than any other man. But I can promise to love you with the entirety of my heart, protect you with all the strength in my body, cherish you with my mind and soul for the rest of my life and probably beyond that," he vowed. Bronwyn's cheek was pressed to his chest, and she couldn't see his face, but his voice was husky and trembling with the intensity of his emotions and the veracity of his words. "I adore our daughter, and with you by my side, I'll be the best father I can be. If we should be blessed with other children, I'll adore them too." Bronwyn raised her head from its resting place close to his heart and smiled up at him soggily. She adjusted her position sinuously until she was straddling his hips, with her hands braced against his chest. "I love you too," she reaffirmed. "Flaws and all, Bryce. The only person who ever demanded perfection from you was you. You're not perfect, but you're perfect for me. I'll cherish and protect your heart today, tomorrow, and forever." He reached up to cup her face with gentle hands, tugging her down for a fierce kiss. "Forever?" he asked shakily after releasing her lips. She smiled again before tracing an X across his heart and then dropping her head to kiss the spot she had just marked. "Yes. Forever." Bryce's broad chest heaved in a shuddering sigh of contentment before he dragged her down to snuggle against his chest. Bronwyn burrowed against him and smiled drowsily when she felt him stroking her hair languidly. They were silent for a few long moments, and Bronwyn was on the verge of dozing off when she heard his voice. It was quiet but filled with the awe of a man who was just now recognizing a completely unfamiliar emotion. "I'm happy." That was all anyone could ever ask for. Eplogu Yuri, what? Bryce stared blankly into Bronwyn's beaming face. They were in his study, and she had seated herself in the chair opposite his desk. "Pregnant," she enunciated and signed the word, but he still blinked stupidly for a few moments. Her chest heaved in a clearly exasperated sigh before she got up, rounded his desk to shout it directly into his ear. "Pregnant." He jumped as his hearing aid squealed. He now had only 45 decibel hearing loss in his right ear after finally deciding to try that operation the year before. He still couldn't follow conversations very well unless the speaker was sitting close to him, positioned on his right side, and his hearing aid was on. The operation hadn't really changed his life much, except that his wife and daughter now sometimes felt the need to shout things directly into his ear when they felt he wasn't paying close enough attention to them. He had only done it to hear Kayla's laughter, and when he'd heard it for the first time, he had been gratified to learn that she did have her mother's laugh after all. "You're pregnant," he said on a slow exhalation of breath, and Bronwyn nodded down at him with a grin. He felt his own lips stretching into a matching grin. They had suspected that she might be, even though they'd only recently decided to try for a second child. Bronwyn had just taken on a partner at her veterinary clinic, precisely for this purpose, and Kayla had just started her second year at school. Their dramatic daughter had recently been making smart-arsed comments about not wanting to be an only child for the rest of her life. Especially since her cousin Reese had recently acquired a baby sister, and even little Lily DeLucci, whom Kayla seemed to consider both rival and friend, was a big sister twice over thanks to the twin girls her mother had given birth to a few years before. Hating to be left out of anything, Kayla had placed an order for a little brother because neither Reese nor Lily had one. Oh my God. Bryce leaped to his feet and swung Bronwyn up into a hug. That's fantastic news, sweetheart. He dropped her back onto her feet and gave her a quick, concerned once-over. What did the doctor say? Is everything okay? He asked worriedly. I'm healthy as a horse. Baby's due in about 7 months' time. Just before Christmas, you always know just what to get us for Christmas, he teased. I try my best. She shrugged modestly. God, he loved her so much. They had remarried nearly 5 years ago, less than a month after his proposal. Their marriage, even now, was filled with surprise after surprise. He wanted to create amazing memories with spontaneous trips to Europe when she wasn't busy with work, hot air balloon rides, flowers, jewelry, and toys for Kayla. And even more disastrous romantic meals that he had cooked himself. In the interests of self-preservation, Bronwyn had enrolled him in a cordon bleu cooking course. He'd had minimal success in the class. Now, instead of merely burning steaks, he burned things like glazed duck and stuffed pheasant. He pretended not to notice his wife and daughters exchanged grimaces when they knew that he would be cooking dinner. He was damned determined to conquer the cooking thing. He couldn't imagine not succeeding at it. Okay, so it was taking him a little longer than he'd anticipated, years really, but he knew that he could do it. Bryce absolutely doted on his girls and loved spoiling them. And Bronwyn had stopped protesting at the extravagance when she had seen how much pleasure he got out of his surprises. He couldn't imagine his life without them and was grateful every day for the miracle that had been granted to an undeserving man like him. You're amazing, he murmured, sitting back down behind his desk and dragging her into his lap. He was well on his way to showing her just how amazing he thought she was when the study door was flung open unceremoniously, and their daughter dashed into the room. Oliver, their excitable and yappy little red miniature pinscher, followed her into the room. Kayla was still wearing her school uniform, and her braid was an unraveling mess that created a halo of escaped hair around her gamine little face. Guess what? She asked breathlessly. So used to seeing her parents snuggling that she didn't even pause on her way to his desk. What? Bronwyn asked with a grin. Ms. Williams gave me 2 gold stars today, the little girl boasted, practically bouncing up and down in excitement. She did? Bronwyn smiled, signing at the same time so that Bryce could follow the conversation. That's fantastic, Munchkin, Bryce said. He had his head on Bronwyn's shoulder and one hand protectively tucked against her flat stomach. What for? I got 10 out of 10 for my spelling and for my math. She signed a mile a minute, her little hands practically a blur. Wow, I think that calls for a celebration, don't you? He asked them indulgently, and Bronwyn nodded, knowing that he meant to celebrate more than Kayla's gold stars. Naturally, they wouldn't tell Kayla about the baby for a while. She would be an unholy, impatient little terror if she found out and then had to wait months before the baby was born. It's definitely cause for celebration, Bronwyn agreed with a smile. Kayla, go and have a bath and put on your prettiest dress, we're going out to dinner. Really? Her beautiful blue eyes shone with pride and her parents nodded. She squealed in excitement and careened back out of the room with Oliver racing out after her. Thank you, Bryce whispered quietly, and Bronwyn craned her neck to meet his eyes. She asked everything, he said expansively before elaborating. For the small, everyday things and the huge, life-altering things. His eyes went misty, and he blinked in embarrassment. When he was able to see her face clearly again, she was smiling luminously. He watched her hands and her face as they spelled out her inevitable response, the one that never failed to bring a lump to his throat and tears to his eyes. There's the man I married.